I think I have to preface some of my remarks with my sense that this second round vote has been completely wrongly understood by the British press. The notion that the Front National has been stopped in its tracks is nonsense. So that's the first thing I would say. I think in response to the Paris attacks, what is worth saying is that this election has gone forward in a situation of real anxiety. Now I know that it's often very mal vu to understand a nation as if it were a person with a character and attitudes and so on. In this case, I think it's probably quite an apt analogy that France is in a real state of national anxiety, and in part you might also extend the analogy and say that these regional elections, and particularly round 1 and 2, also demonstrate a kind of schizophrenia. That it's very difficult grabbing hold and analysing the role of emotion in politics, but in this case it is of enormous consequence. It's interesting that the French often refer to the term insecurity. In fact, security, 20 years ago when I used to translate it as law and order. Now, insecurity in French, insécurité, it's not just a state of precarious state of living, it's almost a state of mind. And so you've got to imagine that you've got this Western democracy with its kind of cycle of elections going on in a situation where there is a kind of, and again, it's another analogy, but I think it's appropriate, there's a drama going on, almost a psychodrama going on. And the Front National has played into this, has entered this scene. Their popularity was going up before. A little while before, it looked as if Les Républicains were going to do better. But with the Paris attacks, everybody expected the Front National to do well. Now, the Front National, in my view, did do well, did extremely well in the second round as well. The fact that they actually increased their vote to nearly 7 million from just over 6 million in round 2. So the idea that they were knocked for 6, they were knocked for 6 by the system, not by the underlying issues and the underlying problems. So I think this kind of anxiety, this national anxiety, has to be taken into consideration. And in fact, it's possible, it's paradoxical, that round 1 is a kind of an anxiety that pushes you towards Le Pen, and round 2, given all the other people who came out and at last voted in round 2, is demonstrating an anxiety is, do we really want to go down that road right now? So there's kind of, nothing's been solved, if you like, and the system has been misused. It has been misused by the main parties because you can stand down for an opponent to block somebody if you want in a double round system, but that's not what a proportional system is designed for. And these regional elections are proportional elections, and you have proportional elections in order that all the parties get the proportion of what people want. So what the socialists did in Nord-Pas-de-Calais, Picardy, and in PACA was to change the rules of the game, if you like, by standing down to block the Front National. Now, we might argue that the Front National is so dangerous that that's what has to be done. But it's worth raising that point because what it does is it proves Marine Le Pen's point that these parties are complicit, and they're not, but an awful lot of people are going to be confirmed in their view that these parties are complicit.
How has it been reported in France?
It's a very strange thing because it was there was a morosity amongst, or moroseness, I'm not quite sure which, amongst the winners.
Yeah.
The winners did not claim triumph anywhere, apart from Valérie Pécresse against the Socialist Party in the biggest region, the Paris region, really, and Le Drian, the defense minister in Brittany. Now, they were seen as real triumphs. The others were seen as, we got this by, cooking the books.
By hook or by crook, and by kind of blocking. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, now, as far as the Front National goes, the only criticism has been from Marine's father, who says she ran a bad campaign. We'll see what happens inside. Their problem is that once they get through to the second round of anything, they've got nobody to ally with. So they can't really increase their vote. So there's some hope that they might get together with a kind of bit of a crazy right-wing group called Debout la France. But that's tiny. But what they are already doing is they're planning for 2017. And one of the things that she is doing, Marine, the aunt, is doing what her father didn't do and should have done if you want to win in the Front National, is that she is concentrating on both the presidency and the legislatives. He only concentrated on the presidency, and he let the rest kind of go wherever it wanted to go, apart from 86, where PR got them 36 seats. So that's the issue, is that the Front National are organizing from this morning.
I think these events have created a range of different responses among Muslims across Europe. Both in the UK and in France, but also in Belgium, you can see a variety of activities going on in terms of civil society movements rising up. For instance, in Belgium, the European Muslim Network has organized demonstrations to show that Muslims can also be faithful citizens in European societies. In France, there's been also an attempt on the part of visible Muslim communities to also speak out in the press to show again that they have a different view from the attackers. But broadly speaking, there is also the risk that these attacks and also the consequent responses on the part of the different governments and the counterterrorism measures that are likely to be put in place in France, copying the UK, by the way, could also lead to a sense of withdrawal, to a sense of being left down by society and by the government. And broadly speaking, in the past, for instance, after the 7/7 attacks, what we saw in the UK was that the Muslim community was very divided because they felt attacked on all fronts, on the part of the terrorists that were manipulating their own faith, on the part of the right-wing parties that are trying to develop a whole argument and a whole strategy, political strategy, at the damage of Muslim communities, and also on the part of governments that are trying to squeeze and try to either recruit Muslims as informants or to try to control them and to manage Muslims. And this is very difficult for a range of reasons, not least because of the moment in which you start to deal with Muslim communities, you have to bring in the topic of religion, how to deal with religious minorities. And I can see that this is going to be particularly difficult in a society like France, which is built upon the premises of laïcité, and also it's been reluctant to engage with the topic of religion so far and to recognize actually the existence of religious minorities, in particular Muslims. The French should really look at the reports and studies that were done in the UK in relation to the effectiveness of PREVENT, and which many academics have shown that actually not only it has been ineffective, but sometimes it has been counterproductive to engage in excessive policing of communities. And also, even though I see the benefits of providing more social services for particular target communities, at the end of the day, if the social service provision, which is part of the Channel project here in the UK, is then connected with a clear suspectification of a particular community, then you're going to demonize a whole chunk of your own society, and you could provide ammunition for the Islamists active in ISIS or similar groups to recruit young people that feel alienated or not necessarily completely alienated, but even disconnected or disappointed by the way in which their own societies are developing.
But what's the alternative then? I mean, how are you going to be able to counter this, the lure of the radical message?
Well, I think it matters because it's very sad that Europe, whether we intend it as European Union or the sum of our nation states, if we are unable to sell a vision of the future to these younger populations, it means in a way that our societies have failed. Mm-hmm. And also, I don't want to, people are attracted to that because maybe they don't have other goals into their own lives because they have not seen the point of participating in politics because they see of the decline in a way of the democratic system. So in a way, it's important to reinvigorate the democratic system and to reinvigorate the sense of civic participation overall in society. I'm always a bit suspicion of those programs that are deliberately targeting specific communities, because the moment in which you do that, then you segregate society, and in a way you do the game of the Islamists and of the radicals who are trying to point to young Muslims that actually they are abandoned by their own societies.
If I've looked across the rise of radical parties or populist parties, one of the ways they're defining themselves at the moment is trying to associate themselves with what they call core European values. They want to make Islam the other, to try to define these parties as being representing the real Europe in a way.
They would view the attacks in Paris as a validation of what many sort of thinkers on the radical right have been arguing for some time. It's an idea that goes back to the 70s and 80s called the Eurabia thesis, which is that Europe over time will become Islamified and through disproportionately high birth rates within Muslim communities or through terrorism, Europe and its values will come increasingly under threat from these external threats as the radical right sees it. And I think what's interesting, if you looked at the polls in Europe today, if you look, for example, at Austria or the Netherlands, you have the anti-EU, anti-Islam, anti-immigration radical right comfortably in first place. In Switzerland, the People's...
By first place, you mean the party with the greatest support?
In first place in the polls,
which should be sort of, what, a 25, 27, 28, up to 30%?
Well, it depends where you're looking. If you look at the Netherlands, Wilders has currently more support than the governing parties combined. Wow. So he is currently on set to have a very good election, were one held tomorrow. Switzerland, the Swiss People's Party, a slightly different type of party, but nonetheless quite hostile to Islam and immigration, just received the highest share of the vote for a radical right party in post-war European history. And then you're seeing the emergence of sort of more new non-electoral groups like Pegida in Germany, which are trying to mobilize more direct forms of opposition to these perceived threats. Now, one of the interesting questions is why are these parties continuing to poll so strongly in some countries, right? I mean, it's important to point out that in some of the countries that have been most strongly hit by austerity, you actually don't have successful radical right parties. In Spain, for example, or Portugal, but in others you do. And I would suggest that one of the reasons why these parties have continued to poll well throughout the 1980s, 90s and 2000s is that the underlying foundations of European politics are beginning to change, and they're beginning to move away from the old left-right economic dimension, which set some pretty clear dividing lines that enabled social democrats and conservatives to mobilize support among particular groups. That old left-right economic dimension has increasingly been replaced by what political scientists would call a new cultural cleavage in European politics, which has seen issues like security, immigration, national identity become far more important to voters when they're making their decisions, and in particular to voters who feel economically left behind from the transition to global economies, who feel under threat from rapidly rising ethnic and cultural diversity, and who feel what the Parisian academics would call cultural insecurity, who feel that their values and their ways of life are somehow challenged by these broader processes. So the attacks in Paris are seen as merely the latest vindication of that narrative that the radical right is pushing. And your comment is exactly right, in that unlike Jean-Marie Le Pen in the 80s and unlike Jörg Haider in the 90s, which we spent a lot of time talking about, the radical right today is now far more vocal in claiming that only it is defending liberal values, whether those relate to the rights of women, the rights of homosexual communities, whether that defense relates to long liberal traditions. And that is an innovation within the radical right narrative that is bringing it into a sort of growing interaction with the Islamist form of extremism. And if you look at, say the work of Leonard Weinberg or Roger Eatwell, about 15 years ago, both of those academics argued that the big challenge that European states would face is not from Islamist extremism, nor from right-wing extremism, but from what they call cumulative extremism, which is one bouncing off the other as their worldviews increasingly come into touch. And that's certainly what you're seeing in some cases and in the debate after Paris.
Just a last shot to you, John. When you look ahead in France, do you think at all that the Paris attacks could have a sort of counter effect, and that this kind of extremism might lead to some coming together around established parties? Is that fanciful, or do you think that's...
It would be. It's desirable, but there are a couple of problems. I mean, one is this ceiling just keeps going up.
The ceiling for the
for the FN, and there is always an assumption that that's as far as they go, and then the next polls and elections up they go again. I think the problem is that the established parties are. We're on the record here, aren't we? So,
yes, we are.
Yeah. The established parties...
But you're an academic, so you can say whatever you want.
I mean, both Les Républicains and the Parti Socialiste and the Front de Gauche are amateurs in addressing this problem. None of them know what to do. And they still don't. And they still keep saying, right, we've learned the lessons this time. We hear you. We hear that cry of despair. And what's going to happen is there's going to be internecine warfare within Les Républicains now. And François Hollande is going to make the huge mistake of assuming that this will make his popularity rocket. And his popularity has gone up, but this is like the medieval king's two bodies, the sacred and the profane. It's the sacred, him as the embodiment of France, not him as François Hollande, who should have seen all this coming and done something about it, so that his popularity will fall.
Yep.
And there hasn't been a decent debate about anything, like, for example, the point you were making about the relationship between security and social policy, uniting these things. How do you bring the communities that you're trying to sort out, how do you bring them into the discussion?